Morning, everybody. You know, it's the only thing better than being in a crowded room and sitting in circles around tables is being in a crowded room when it's been raining and everybody's wet. I just wanted to say one more time, just as we get started, if you brought along the notes from last week, great, because we weren't finished. If not, there are lots of extra copies at the back table. And so we're still going to be working on session 1 for a little bit. And in just a moment, we're actually going to pick up where we left off with that little section of reading where we were going to compare some texts. So we have Revelation 12 alongside Matthew 2 and informed by some of the language from Psalm 2. So in just a moment, we're going to dive right back into the deep end about what an apocalypse is. But just to kind of get started on a bit lighter note, I want to talk about the way we use language, all right? So we use symbols and images all the time. And if you've ever run into someone who, says, I don't like it when Bible teachers and people who preach and teach the Bible try to explain everything away. Let's just read the Bible and get the plain meaning. And the frustration that I sometimes have when people launch that argument is that we don't do that ourselves. We use language in pictorial and symbolic ways all the time. So I'm not going to bore you with the entire list that this particular author put together, but let me give you a few examples of common English metaphors. All right, to twist your arm, to have an axe to grind, to beat a dead horse, to bend over backwards, to blow your top, to blow your brains out, to be a loose cannon, to stir up a hornet's nest, to escape the jaws of death, to jump down your throat, to lay it on thick. Those are all examples of things we say that we don't mean literally. We're serious very often when we say these things, but serious and literal are not necessarily the same thing. And here's what's interesting about that phenomenon, about symbolic language. When you translate from one language into another, the metaphors from one language don't necessarily make sense in the next language. And there's a few examples in this book in French, but I'm actually going to give you one from my background, growing up speaking German. So I didn't learn to speak English until I went to kindergarten in Canada. And so, for example, once I was speaking English, we had phrases like to bite the dust, right? What does that mean? If we say he bit the dust, what does that mean? He lost or he died, right? Yeah. The way we mean it most seriously is to say he died, he bit the dust. So I went to my dad at one point, once I was in my 20s and thinking about language, I said, hey Dad, is there a German expression for he bit the dust? Because ist Staub just doesn't seem to work in German. It just doesn't have the same effect as he bit the dust. So my dad said, yeah. He says, for example, frisst Gras. He's eating grass. It's a phrase that means he's dead. It's also an equivalent phrase to our English, he kicked the bucket, right? So my dad and I started talking about the phrase, he kicked the bucket. And I said, Dad, is there one like that in German? And he said, yeah, there is. He says, it goes like this. Guckt sich die Radieschen von unten an. He's looking at the radishes from underneath. I mean, in English, that doesn't make, that's not going to mean anything to anyone to say, yeah, he's looking at the radishes from underneath. But in German, it means kick the bucket. At least that's one way to do that. You will have many more examples, I'm sure. The point is this. We use language all the time. We're serious when we use it. And yet we may not be literal in the way we use that. And there are important messages that we communicate. And sometimes the exact words or the literal definition of those words isn't necessarily what we mean. And that's the illustration I want to use to start this morning by saying apocalypses are often deadly serious, very often have significant messages for their audiences, and yet the way they say what they say is often to use symbolic language or to use ways of speaking, metaphors, numbers, phrases, idioms, labels, sometimes pejorative terms, sometimes glowing terms, but they use these in a way that's creative. And there's a message to be unpacked. And here's the interesting thing. Just like when I said to you, he kicked the bucket, nobody here has to know, what do you mean by that, right? Even though it's a metaphor, you all we have this common commerce of language. You know what I'm talking about when I say that phrase. But if I were just to walk in here and start using German idioms or French idioms, we would need some translation. So I hope you're not frustrated when I make a comment like last week when I said, this document made sense to the first audience, to the original hearers and readers, but we have some work to do to get back to that. And some may argue and say, aren't you making reading and understanding the Bible complicated? It's simple. Well, the point is that we're removed by time and by language and several other layers that require us to do some extra work for interpretation. So here's what I'd like you to do. We're going to pray, and then you remember I suggested to you that most people say that there are two birth narratives of Jesus in the New Testament. And I suggested to you that there are three, and that the third one is found in Revelation 12. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask you, based on the little chart that I have, just to kind of conceptually help you think through the two texts in front of you, I'm going to ask you to look over the passage from Matthew 2, compare it to Revelation 12, and just talk to each other about the setting, the characters, the plot of the account, and what the messages might be in the text, and see if you can see some differences and some similarities. Before we do that, let's commit our time to the Lord in prayer. Father, I'm so grateful to you this morning on a rainy Sunday in Fresno, which is a great thing to say in and of itself. We want to thank you for the grace of every new breath, every new day. And thanks so much for the opportunity to come together like this and to talk about a work of literature which is at the same time filled with theological conviction and power, and has also been subject to a lot of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. So we ask for your grace. We don't assume that we're better than any generation before us, but we hope to model their seriousness and their effort in terms of hearing what your Spirit has to say to us. Thank you for all of that in Christ's name. Amen. All right, let's start talking to each other. And there are some seats, probably 5, 6, 7 seats up here around the tables. Again, if you didn't get this handout or weren't here last week or just didn't bring it back, there are extra copies on the back table, right? Let's talk about these two passages. So just compare them.
You gotta find the seat.
I can read the Revelation. Okay, I'll read the Matthew one from here. Okay, so a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out.
One way to do this is, when you've read the two passages, maybe work from Matthew chapter 2, right, which is a story that many of us will be familiar with, and then ask yourself the question, do you see some parallels or some similarities in Revelation 12?
She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous red dragon with 7 heads and horns and 7 crowns on his head. Okay, his child who will rule all nations with an iron scepter. And her child was snatched up to God at Shemaiah's throne. The woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,204 years.
After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, he saw a star when it rose and when he had called together all the priests and teachers of the law, he asked them when the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, for the Father's house.
All right. How many of you are in the camp that says, I have no idea what Herms thinks we're going to find here, but I don't see a lot of similarities? Okay, there's a few. Let's start with some observations from you. Has anybody found something in Matthew 2 that you pick up in Revelation? What's the most obvious similarity between the two accounts? There's a pregnant woman and a birth, right? Yeah. Okay. And then the next thing is there's part of the plot twist that there's some threat to the baby's life. That also appears in Matthew 2. What else do you find?
The pregnant woman and child.
Okay,
Well,
yeah.
at least they lead.
Yes.
One, they flee together.
Right. If you read right to the end of Revelation 12, not only do they flee, but they flee into the wilderness, which recalls some of the part of Matthew 2 where the family of Jesus is urged by a dream to flee to Egypt, right? Which, by the way, was the site of Israel's wilderness wanderings, right? So you can see the author of Revelation working with historical details, but he's not concerned to tell you in propositional fact what happened. He's chosen to take, and I'll use this phrase from last week's session, he's chosen to take an ancient form of multimedia and just kind of explode the historical details onto a fantastic cosmic scale. So here's the point. Revelation 12 sounds mythic, cosmic, incredible, world and universe shaping and shaking. And on the other hand, it is tied intimately to historical details of the account of the birth of Jesus that many of us are not only familiar with, but perhaps overly familiar with. And so it's important for us to see that on the one hand, the author of Revelation wasn't dreaming up stuff that had never happened. On the other hand, it's also important to recognize that he's telling these accounts in a completely different way. So before we move further, I want to ask this question. Why? Why do you think this author, this Christian pastor, who clearly is also creative, he's a poet, he's imaginative, why does he choose this sort of ancient form of multimedia to tell what to you and I is a very simple, we'd call it the Christmas story? Any thoughts? Why does he choose this medium? Yeah?
Maybe to show it in a new way, because
Okay.
like you said, we've become overly familiar with the story.
Right. Okay, very good. So this idea of the baby in the manger, and you think about people, and perhaps not so much for those outside the church, but if you've grown up in the church and watched Christmas pageants and showed your kids Veggie Tales of Christmas stories and these kinds of things, I mean, there's just this oversaturation, which on the one hand makes you very familiar, but perhaps also dulls you, like Adam said, to the significance of what's going on. What else? Yeah.
Could there be both of these things happening simultaneously? He saw the spiritual side of this,
Okay.
and we saw the physical side of this. And could there be two narratives running parallel?
Okay. So I guess what I'd ask in response to you is, are you suggesting two things are going on at the same time, or are you suggesting these are two very different ways of telling the same story? Yeah. Yes.
The answer is yes.
To both?
Yes.
Okay. I hear what you're saying. Yes, Larry.
He is in the Spirit,
Right. Okay.
which means that this is a revelation. He's not necessarily trying to think in Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and I heard behind me a loud voice with the trumpet. And so whatever that is all about, he's interpreting what he has actually heard and
Sure.
what he is actually seeing.
Yeah. So I suppose, I think what I hear you saying is, on the one hand, the answer to the question why could just be, he's just trying to report exactly what he saw.
Well, but
On-
I'm also thinking trance-like stuff
Okay?
going on, so
Yeah.
that he is sort of transported out of his own body in a sense.
Okay.
Could be.
And I guess the question is, why doesn't he bother then to kind of bring it back down to more what we would call recognizable, historical, this worldly? Why is it this ancient multimedia? Why such a dramatic, unbelievable? Adam, and then in the back, yeah.
I'm going to guess that it has to do with Jewish symbols and numerology to help tell a story that is more impactful
Okay.
to the Jewish culture.
Right. Okay. And in the back?
Maybe because he is kind of giving the whole history of spiritual aspect of the world,
Okay.
and this is Jesus' birth in it.
Okay.
So it's not a literal thing of just Jesus' birth, but him, because they don't even talk about his life and resurrection. They just talk about him being born and going right up again to
Right.
heaven.
Right.
So it's just like, oh, and this happened in all this scheme of everything else that was going on.
Okay. Yeah. Was there one more hand at the back, and then we'll? Yeah. go on.
Just that I think he's enjoying using imagery.
Okay. All right. He's enjoying using the imagery.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Rod, right at the back.
I was just going to pick up on Ham's that in John chapter 1, it's not donkey, Mary, manger. It's light and
Right.
Holy Spirit and
Good.
Jesus coming. So he has a very literal start to his gospel. This is an unliteral descriptive. This is very similar in this
Okay. Yeah.
writing style.
I want to pick up two things that I've heard you say, which I think are really significant. One is this kind of dramatic, fantastical retelling of these events is intended to give us a sense of significance. So it is taking, like Rod said, these literal historical details and throwing them on the canvas of a cosmic drama, of a story that's much bigger than just that one event. And the second thing I would say is that this is about the memorability and perhaps even the memorizability of this kind of material. So someone who sees a shocking video with flashing lights and fast action may remember something or be gripped by something. I guess maybe another way to answer my own question as to why is to say, why do missionaries bring pictures? Why do they bring artifacts, right? Because they want to put you in touch with something that's tangible, that goes beyond someone just standing in front of a room and saying, and then I visited this village, and then we built this hospital, and then we did this. Instead, they want to put you in touch with what they're doing and place you into the story. And that, I think, is part of what's going on here in the apocalypse. This kind of form of communication is intended to draw the reader in and help them to remember, to locate themselves, and to remember what's going on. There's one more reason why I think the author goes this route. But for that, you have to turn to page 4 in your notes. So I'm going to ask you to skip to the bottom half of page 4 and take 30 seconds to read through the Python myth, all right? And then I'll tell you a little bit more about it. So having read Matthew 2 and Revelation 12, then I want you to just have a look at the Python myth, and then we'll come back for some discussion.
This form of the Python myth was written down by
Somebody.
H-Man, sometime prior to the 1807. His works can be found in N. Grant, The Myth of H-Man, University of Kansas. Python, son of Terra, was a huge dragon who was accustomed to giving oracles on Mount Well-Vernosus before the time of Apollo. He was informed by an oracle that he would be destroyed by the offspring of Zeus. At that time, Zeus was the leader of Legend. When Zeus's wife, Hera, learned of this, she decreed that Legend should give birth at a place where the sun was not reached. When Python received the
what you're reading here is an Egyptian version of a common myth in the ancient world. And it's the story of a son of the gods whose life is threatened by a great serpent or dragon. And the way in which that son of the gods asserts authority is to find a way, even just in the birth or in the first few days after birth, to find a way to kill this adversarial serpent or dragon. Right? And I know I'm going to risk muddying the waters here, but it's important for us to know that this story, in a Greco-Roman version of it, was adopted by the emperor of the time, Domitian, to tell the story of his accession to the throne. And so this account of the son of the gods who comes, and some of you will know that Roman emperors, over a period of time, there was this developing idea that the emperors were sons of the gods. At first, the emperors were happy with this notion that at their death, they would go to the right hand of the gods. Eventually, though, with people like Caligula and Nero and Domitian, they weren't satisfied with post-mortem, after-death deification. They wanted to hear, in their lifetime, you are a god, right? You are a son of the gods. So this is part of the story. So the question is not only relationship potentially between Matthew 2 and Revelation 12. The question really becomes, John the pastor knows that people in Asia Minor who are part of the churches that he's writing to are very familiar with the story of how the emperor came to power and what the emperor supposedly had to overcome in terms of the slaying of the evil serpent that tried to arrest his own life. And what the author here is doing is taking the biblical text, Psalm 2, he's taking accounts that he knows of the birth of Jesus, which we later find written in the Gospels, like Matthew 2 and Luke 2, and he's prepared to use the myths of his day and take all of those bits and pieces and craft a new story, which the plot isn't new so much to Christians who hear it, but the way in which it comes to them is entirely new and different. So an apocalypse is basically a pastiche, a collection of different bits and pieces. So I don't know if any of you in the room, or maybe your kids, had to do a project in school where you made something, a sculpture or something, out of different bits of recycling. Anybody ever have to do that? Or anybody here good at repurposing things for new uses? Right? And, it's the kind of thing, when Kath and I, when our kids did that, it's the kind of thing that looks awesome when they first bring it home from school, and then after 2 weeks it's just kind of kicking around the house, and eventually it's just recycling itself, right? It goes out with the garbage. That probably tells you too much about what kind of parents we are. But the point is that the book of Revelation is taking the biblical text, what Israelites believed about Messiah. It's taking details of what Christians believed had happened in history about the person Jesus, born in Bethlehem from Nazareth. And it's also tying into popular myths about the ruler of the world, the emperor of the Roman Empire. And the author's saying, let me take all of that information and tell you about the true ruler of the cosmos. Right? So that's in part what an apocalypse does, and it's trying to arrest our attention. So I want to ask you the question, how do you respond or react to that possibility that the author of Revelation may have been prepared to use what we might otherwise consider a blasphemous Python myth from pagan civilization? I mean, it's just interesting the terms that Christians use to kind of say other people's stories aren't as good as our stories. And I'm not suggesting that those stories are equally as valid. What I want to suggest is that those stories become material that the author of Revelation is prepared to use to tell the story of who Jesus is and what his significance in the world is. So, thoughts, reactions, questions? Yeah. Sorry, we'll come back here.
You have to be, if you're going to reach the population in which you're working with, you have to connect with them. So in a lot of ways, it's an evangelical tool to be able to say, like, this is where you're at,
what's interesting about your comment is that it assumes that the Christians in Asia Minor were pretty well connected, knew the stories, lived in that world, knew what the emperor had to say, and maybe even were impressed with the emperor. That's not the traditional story that Christians have been told about who the people in the book of Revelation were. I think it's probably fair, and you don't have to nod your head if this resonates with you, but many people have been told that the Christians in the book of Revelation were severely persecuted, that John was in exile on Patmos, that life was hard, and the book of Revelation is basically just an encouragement to say, hold on, Jesus wins in the end, kind of a thing. But that's not really fair to the chapters 2 and 3 messages where we find Christians whose own assessment of themselves seems to be, I'm rich, I'm well clothed, I can see, I have perspective, and some of the warnings that occur in those letters suggest to us that the Christians in Asia Minor, in large part, were quite well connected socially and knew the stories and perhaps were even impressed by the emperor. So I think your comment's a really good one. It's going to take us to a session just a little bit down the road when we actually say, who were these Christians that were written to? But for now, I think it's important that we just see that the author's prepared to use this kind of culturally relevant material. Yeah?
I just had to remind us of Star Wars and Harry Potter. You know,
Right.
the Force, and the magic and all that stuff. I mean, that's appearing if you turn on the TV to any kind of religious program, you're going to get some images
Right.
that are coming at us from using things that some could designate as being, very, not Christian in their essence, but
Sure.
have a message that Christians recognize and respond to. So.
Yeah,
There we
or at the very least contain images and ideas that Christians can appropriate.
There you go.
And that's a big word, but it just basically means to take something and use it for your own purposes. To appropriate something is to say, I'm going to use this for what I can use it for, but in my own way. And I think that happens all the time. And those are two great examples you used. There was a question here, and then I want to go to a slide, and I want to ask you the question, but where does all this serpent dragon stuff come from anyways? And was John just, overly imaginative? Yes?
The Bible says Satan is a deceiver. When you deceive, you try to make something look like the original. Right? You hand somebody a $100 bill.
Right.
It looks exactly like the one the government prints.
Sure.
But it's a fake. It's a deceit. So I think Satan in his cleverness will try to present a picture of the cosmos
Right.
that looks very real to people. I mean, they
Yes.
believe it. I
Yes.
assume they believe it.
Sure.
And John is trying to say, no, this is the fake, this is the original.
Yeah.
They look a lot the same. They're immensely different.
That's a fantastic observation. We're going to come back to this when we look at Revelation 13, where we have a beast from the sea and a beast on the land. And the word parody is going to come up a lot, where the author of Revelation seeks to... Remember what we talked about? I had the picture of the Wizard of Oz last week, remember that? Where an apocalypse is trying to pull back the curtain and say, here's what's really going on in the world. And this falls right in line with this observation that the book of Revelation seeks to say, you've heard a certain kind of myth. Let me tell you the cosmic version of that story that takes seriously the God of Israel and the salvation that's brought by his Messiah, Jesus. Back to this serpent dragon stuff, all right? Let's look at a few passages from our Bibles, right? The book of Psalms, and then Isaiah as well. So I'm going to read you 3 passages, and I want you, when I get to the end of the third one, I want you to tell me what you hear here that might connect to what we're talking about in the book of Revelation. Psalm 74. Yet God my King is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. Think about what that might refer to. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads, plural, of Leviathan singular. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. Right? Next passage, Psalm 104. Yonder is the sea, great and wide. Creeping things innumerable are there, living things both small and great. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it. These all look to you to give them their food in due season. What do you notice between these two passages? Besides the fact that the author of these Psalms clearly was prepared to talk about multi-headed monsters in the sea. Anyone?
They're all creatures created by God. God is over any creature, no matter how ominous it may look.
Okay, very good. And any difference between the first and the second one?
This one's positive, the other is negative.
Right. So in this one, Leviathan appears to be a destructive, threatening, negative creature of some sort and is crushed. In the next one, Leviathan is part of the created order. And again, I think Peter's comment is highly instructive. The presentation isn't so much about what's the scientific or biological explanation of this psalm. It's more about what does this author believe about God and his relationship to creation. Now look at one more. So we had sort of a past destroying of Leviathan, a present sovereign governing, boundarying of Leviathan. Now look at this text from Isaiah. And on that day, right, and anybody who's read the Hebrew Bible prophets knows that that day is the day of Yahweh's great judgment. So now we're talking eschatology. The author's looking into the future. On that day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. All right? All of this imagery. So it's one thing for me to show you the Python myth and say, here's what the emperors believed. The truth is that John simply stands in a long line of biblical authors that were prepared to engage their world, use the language and the symbols of their world, and tell a different story. Almost like, and I think maybe the term was used here, a counter story, an alternative story, or maybe even from the perspective of the authors, the true story, or the real story. All right? So all of that is going on here. So I realize that we've done some discussion, we've looked at a bunch of different texts. Let me tell you, I hope this isn't confusing, my rationale for starting not with Revelation 1, but with Revelation 12, was to suggest to you that at the heart of the book is this vision of the entire cosmos. And at the center of the cosmos is an event that for the author shapes everything else in human history. And that is the coming of Israel's Messiah. So at various points of detail, things like who is the woman in Revelation 12? Well, if you talk to our Catholic brothers and sisters, they would tell you that's Mary, right? Most biblical scholars would suggest, and I would agree with them, that this is probably a picture of Israel. Again, if we were to look at lots of examples from the Hebrew Bible prophets, Israel is often referred to as Yahweh's wife, or as the one who's in labor pains and about to give birth. And sometimes that labor pain imagery is used of Israel's own struggles and deficits and sins. At other times, it's the anticipation of God's salvation coming. And that's how this author uses this. For just a moment, I'm going to go back through the notes where we kind of dropped off last time, fill in some blanks for you who are fill-in-the-blank kind of people, and then we'll move on, all right? Because invariably, I get going and I skip stuff, and then people say, hey, you forgot to tell. So we basically suggested from last week, if you go right back to page 2, that apocalypse can refer to an experience of revelation, it can refer to a worldview, and it can refer to a literary genre, or a kind of literature. And my suggestion to you was that most of what we watch from Hollywood or in television that's apocalyptic fits into number 2. The book of Revelation, from my perspective, fits into numbers 1 and 3. All right? And different apocalypses have different combinations. Many early Jewish apocalypses also have number 2. They have this impending end of the world kind of worldview. I don't think the book of Revelation thinks that the end of the world is just around the corner. But I will have more to say about that in just a moment. On that point, important ways Revelation does not look like an early Jewish apocalypse. There's a lack of secrecy. So the author is known. That's one blank in your outline. The information is open. All right? So unlike early Jewish apocalypses, where a pseudonym, a fake name, or an alternative name, or no name was used, John comes right out and says, you know me, I know you. To the Christians in these churches, this is John, your brother. All right? So he's known. And then the information is open. So unlike at the end of the book of Daniel, where Daniel is told, seal up the words of this prophecy, in an almost word-for-word counter message, at the end of the book of Revelation, John is told, do not seal up the words of this prophecy. All right? So this apocalypse also has, secondly, what I've got in your notes, a letter or an epistolary frame. In other words, the beginning and the end of the book look and sound like New Testament letters. And the reason for that is this frame is like the vehicle to deliver the apocalypse to the churches. And it's best explained by, and this is the blank on your notes, John's absence. He's not there to prophesy. So the next best thing is to write something in the form or in the frame of a letter that really is an apocalypse. All right? Okay. I think we can move forward. Page 2 was your reading. And then page 3, there are a couple of blanks on your outline there that I'll just walk us through. All right. When we talk about how the book of Revelation uses what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, this is the top of page 4 for you. Here are some observations. So, for example, we've just scratched the surface of how the author uses the Old Testament. And I've told you that he's using bits and pieces from Old Testament, from gospel traditions, from pagan myths in the world around him, and he's creating this ancient multimedia presentation. But in terms of how he uses his Bible, or what we call the Old Testament, Revelation contains no direct quotations from the Hebrew Bible. So that's the blank on your outline, top of page 4. No direct quotations. At the same time, there are more allusions or indirect use of Old Testament traditions in Revelation than in the remainder of the New Testament combined. All right? So there are over 600 allusions or indirect references. And the reason for this, I think, is just like the author took the Python myth and used it for his own purpose, the truth is he also uses biblical material and uses it for his own purpose. A few years back, I guess it's about 22 years ago, one of the scholars on the book of Revelation came out with a collection of essays, and the title of the book was The Climax of Prophecy. And Richard Bauckham wrote this collection of essays, and his point in using that title was simply to say, John's not just repeating prophetic traditions. He actually believed himself to be standing on the shoulders of the biblical prophets to have a new perspective or a new take on what it was they were anticipating and hoping for. So, having said all of that, we're going to have to ask the question, what is it that's new for John? All right, and we're going to come to that in just a minute. The third bullet there, we need to be prepared for John's technique, and here's this word I just used, the appropriation of Scripture. All right, he's dependent on the Old Testament, but he's certainly prepared to change, to reuse, to really almost turn things on their heads. And we're going to see that in the very next session now that we move into. Okay, there are some other bits of material that the author is also using. So you'll see on your notes there are other apocalyptic writings that John will have been familiar with. And I'm not going to stand here and say he knew the text just like we know them today, but it's clear in the language he uses that he's operating in a world where he's familiar with a lot of the different traditions that we're now aware of. So, the point is that the book of Revelation is creative, and it is a combination of a lot of different traditions. Page 5 on your notes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on right now because we're going to keep coming back to this. I simply want to point out that apocalypses use metaphor, symbol, and numbers. And this is also then true of the book of Revelation. So this is page 5 for you. Let me just read what I have here and fill in the blanks. Since apocalypses begin as literary compositions, sometimes inspired by visionary experiences, and not oracles or sayings, it's crucial to look for and recognize the structural patterns and literary devices used by the author. These features suggest, and here you have 2 blanks, I just want to emphasize this, intentionality and creativity. So the author is intentional in what he's doing, and he's creative. And here's a couple of different ways this happens. The divisions of time. So you have all kinds of references to time. Things like 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. By the way, anybody see a pattern in those 3 divisions of time? 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days.
It's all the same.
Yeah, give or take, they're all exactly the same. And so when we come to certain places in Revelation where reference is made to these kinds of divisions of time, we have to ask, well, wait a minute, why these numbers? Is there something significant about them? And how can something be so neat and tidy that it's always using the same divisions of time? Well, there's really good reasons for why 7 years, or half of that, 3.5 years, became really important in Jewish apocalyptic ideas of how God would operate in the world. And suffice at this point to say that as we go through the text, I think it will become apparent that the reasons for using these numbers are much greater than the actual value of the numbers themselves. All right? There's lots of introductory phrases or signals in apocalypses. Larry mentioned one earlier, I was in the Spirit. There are others like I looked and I saw, or behold, or in older translations, lo, right? L-O. These are all signals in the text, and just different translations of signals, where the author's trying to tell you, I'm seeing something, or I'm transitioning to seeing something different. And again, this is something that's a little harder for us to appreciate, but in an auditory, oral culture, these kinds of signals would have been picked up by people as they heard this read on the Lord's Day. There are key idioms, terms, figures of speech. So, for example, and you can jot down as many or as few of these as you want, but here are some of the key phrases that will keep coming up in the book of Revelation. The kings of the earth, the inhabitants of the earth, beasts, rulers, the powerful, stars, the sea is a character in the book of Revelation. Colors are really important. Red, black, light, dark. Smoke. Sensory experiences like smelling, tasting, sight, hearing. And here you have another reason for why the author would use an apocalypse. It allows him to use all 5 senses to communicate what he's saying. Numbers are an important part of the symbolism of Revelation. The most common numbers, and I'll just give you a brief overview of what I think their symbolic significance can be, are as follows. So the number 3, very often in biblical traditions, refers to divine activity or divine action. The number 4 is often a number that refers to the earth or to creation in some way. The number 7 is a number that signals perfection or completion. That in itself should help us start to answer the question, why does the author keep measuring time in terms of 3.5? It's always half of complete. It's never perfect or finished when he's using that kind of numbers. Okay, 12 is the number of the people of God in terms of the tribes, the apostles, and that number then gets extrapolated in different ways. So you have the number 24, the 24 elders around the throne in Revelation 4 and 5. which seems to signal all the people of God are accounted for. The 12 tribes, the 12 apostles. Interesting, in the New Jerusalem, you have 12 foundation stones and 12 gates. 12 and 12 again, and 24. The number 1,000 is a number that in the ancient world would have functioned symbolically, although people could, they could literally count up to 1,000, obviously, but it also conceptually had the value of when kids today say cajillion, right? Just more than you can count. And the Greek word for that would have been myriads. There were myriads of angels or myriads of the people of God, or whatever the case might be. So the number 1,000 is intended to signal something infinite or innumerable. And then 144,000 suddenly becomes a combination of 12 and 12 and 1,000. Right? At least those are some options we have. The point is that we can work our way through how the author uses numbers. I'm not going to say anything about the rest of this page. This is page 5 for you. Or I'm not going to say anything about the next section, this table that has an alphabet. We're going to come back to that when we go to Revelation 13 and look at the mark of the beast and what does it mean to number or to count that. And we'll come back to some of this. But I actually think there too, this is not ancient code that, Christians sat in an upper room somewhere trying to crack by candlelight. They knew how to count. And when the author says, hey, listen up. This is the number, this particular beast, this figure, I believe they knew who or what it was that John was talking about. Okay, so some final observations on how symbols get used in Revelation. We'll just fill in the blanks and we'll move on. Some symbols remain constant. So Uncle Sam always looks like Uncle Sam in American political discourse. And in the book of Revelation, there are some symbols that are constant. Beasts always represent world empires, all right? The sea always represents chaos or the mysterious unknown. Second observation, many images in the book of Revelation are fluid. So, for example, a woman can be a wonderful image of God's redemptive work or his salvation, like we saw in Revelation 12. A woman can also function as a harlot or as something quite wicked or destructive or tempting. And that can be problematic to certain readers depending on your background or your experience. But the point is, the author of Revelation isn't always going to say a woman can only work this way or this symbol can only work this way. Lots of symbols are fluid. John's use of Old Testament images, he often breaks them and reuses them. All right? And I'm not going to go into more detail now, but there are things that happen in the Hebrew Bible prophets that turn out one way, and John reverses them. One example, in Revelation 11, the author there uses the image from Zechariah of the destruction of a city that's rebellious against God. And he says that one-tenth of that city is saved. And here's the fascinating thing in Revelation 11. The author uses that Zechariah imagery and says 1/10 of the city is destroyed. So he doesn't necessarily keep with Zechariah's version. He uses that, but he's prepared to say, I see something different as I stand at this vantage point for me in terms of what I think God is doing in history. So the final observation, some images are specific, some are general. All right? So the point, I think, when trying to interpret symbolic language is to say this. It's always best, it's safest, and it's also most helpful to move from the basic to the more complex. You start with what you know, and you move toward what you don't know, rather than the other way around, right? So my final observation on symbols is this. When John tells you what a symbol means, those are the ones we hang on to for dear life, all right? So he tells you what stars are. He tells you what lampstands are. There are certain images, and I've actually given you the passages there. So these notes are things you can take away. You can do a lot more reading on your own. But those are examples of where John actually tells you what a symbol means. Okay? So that kind of brings us to this point where we've said John is writing an apocalypse, and now we're going to move to session 2. I realize I haven't been an incredibly good steward of time because we're almost out of time. But session 2 is on the tables, and it was also on your chairs. So if you want to pull it out for just a moment, let's at least get started with session 2. And this will actually be a good place for us to stop. I want you to look, so session 2 should say page 6, and there should be copies of it on your table. It's the page that has a color picture on the back side. But coming back to the question of why did John use an apocalypse, and is what he does any different, here's what I want us to go away reflecting on, and then we'll come back and talk about it some more next week. Let's look at a quote about a third of the way down on page 6. This comes from John Collins, who has written extensively on early Jewish apocalyptic. He says there's one fundamental difference between Revelation and all Jewish apocalypses. This concerns its location on the historical and geographical timetable. One of the purposes of historical reviews, these are where apocalyptic writers look back over history, one of the purposes of that was to enable readers to understand where they stood in the course of predetermined events. And I'll just stop there for a moment to say, I think many readers of Revelation are still curious that way. Just tell us where we are, how close, what's happening next. That's a significant motivation for a lot of people. But here's what Collins says. Typically, they stood near the end. So in these Jewish apocalypses, people thought, the time is now. It's time to go. God's going to intervene in any moment here. In Revelation, however, as in all early Christian writings, here's the key point. The crucial act of deliverance has already taken place in the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this is a fundamental shift in how... So what's clear here is that this is why I suggest John is not operating with an apocalyptic worldview. He doesn't think the world is going to hell in a handbasket. He doesn't think that God's great kablooey is just around the corner. He's operating with the conviction that God's greatest act of salvation and redemption has already taken place. And that the kingdom of God has things to say about the world in which we now live precisely because it has been embodied in and announced by Jesus. And so my suggestion to you is that the book of Revelation is concerned about Jesus, the Messiah, who brings God's kingdom, and how that changes the way we look at society, politics, culture, myths, dragons, stories. All that is radically reoriented by this idea that God has already broken into human history. I'm sorry if that's anticlimactic, and you were hoping this class would tell you that the great kablooey is in fact just around the corner. But I think that there's so much that's helpful and redemptive in reading Revelation this way. I started with chapter 12, because I thought we first have to try to get our minds around what an apocalypse is. And the second place I'm going to go is chapter 5, because John tells us that he hears about the Lion of Judah, and he turns and looks, and he sees a pathetic, slaughtered lamb. And that to me is the core. I did a lot of my research on early Jewish apocalypses, and I came to the conclusion that there isn't anything about the book of Revelation that's different than any other Jewish apocalypse, except this. It's what the author believes about Jesus. And that reshapes the way he looks at the world. All right? So thanks for your interactions today. It's 5 to 11. Please go ahead and bring back page